purpose in life, as I understood it at that point, was to be a reform agent within the evangelical church. And so I was pursuing God, pursuing Jesus. And as part of that process, my theology began to shift from like a very conservative theological approach that I grew up with to a much more liberal theology. And in that process, my politics slowly began to follow as well. So for context, in 2004, I was a sophomore in college, and I really wanted to vote for John Kerry. But oh man, I was a Republican kid, and I wasn't quite there yet. And I didn't want to vote for George Bush, but oh man, I was a Republican kid. And so I flipped a coin that year because I felt it was my responsibility to vote, and I didn't know what to do.
In the wake of some might say, pivotal election that may have reshaped the American landscape, at least the political landscape, many are pondering, was the race simply a choice between Trump and Harris, or was there something deeper going on? Did it delve into the challenges that are entrenched in this binary thinking that seeks to divide us? In a world that is filled with diverse narrative given to us, are we truly powerless? Or have we relinquished our collective spirit and our collective voice? These are the pressing questions that we're going to unravel in the next 2 episodes of the Dov Baron Show. Come for the stories, stay for the learning. Tap into our community of deeply curious learners by hitting that subscribe button right now. This isn't just another podcast, it's your passport to unparalleled insights. Every episode features the wisdom of global leaders, scientists, entertainers, philosophers, theologians, and journalists. Joining us for the next 2 episodes is Scott Mackey, a dynamic author, activist, entrepreneur who is at the intersection between spirituality, politics, and social change. After having some seriously challenging years in Washington, D.C., influencing foreign policy and leading an Afghan advocacy group, Scott pivoted into the green tech industry, only to discover a deeply fractured system that he once trusted. In his latest book, Love is Not the Answer, Scott captures the national unrest and challenges us to reevaluate our societal values and structures. He's here to help us dissect the outcome of 2024 election, empowering us to reclaim our individual agency and discuss America's critical need for political and spiritual renaissance. Ladies and gentlemen, turn up the volume and help me to welcome insightful author of Love is Not the Answer, Scott Mackey. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Dov, and thank you for the lovely introduction. I appreciate it.
You're welcome, mate. Now, the place I always like to start with every show is the emotional source code of an individual. I sort of talked about this background of you starting in Washington and green space and now where you are. But let's go back further. What sort of brought all that to birth in you? Was there some catalyst maybe in your childhood?
Yeah, absolutely. As with most of us, I felt a lot during my childhood, and not always good things. But when I think about my emotional source code, I really have to come back to the family I came out of. And for me, my parents were missionaries, evangelical missionaries, and missionaries of the sort where, one, they took Jesus and they took the gospel extremely literally. When they read about, when they studied, when they felt into Jesus's life, they heard, "What you do to the least of these, you do unto me." They heard that with great opportunity comes great responsibility. That shaped their life of service. The theological view of Christianity that they came from was extremely conservative, politically right-wing, and built around rules, built around fear, built around staying within these very narrow lines that certain parts of the evangelical church have created for themselves. So that left me in this place where I was, one, in this expansive, heart-centered environment built around service that I grew up in, and two, was racked with fear. I bring all of that up only to say my little system reacted very poorly to that. I was a very stressed out and often unhappy young child who spent years in therapy. I really never began to find myself or a sense of happiness until I really got to the end of high school, and I had light at the end of the tunnel that I was going to be able to get away from my family, get out of my household, and escape to finally have a chance to be myself on my own terms. And so both this desire to be of service, a desire to live from love, but also just deep pain and unhappiness are kind of the two versions of the soil that I grew out of.
That's really interesting, because what you do unto others, you do unto me, is a very spiritual, a very loving sense, and yet you got all the fear from the dogma, which I don't think is unusual. As you know, I studied Christian faith extensively as well, Gnostic and Coptic, although that's different. It still has that sense of this very loving Jesus and this very harsh dogma, which to me, not the truth, to me is unlike Jesus. And it seems like you had that realization even as a child. What would happen when you would bring that, well, you certainly perceived it as a conflict, that conflict up with your parents? What would happen?
Like with a lot of things, the body knows before our conscious mind might know. And so I really just felt it as conflict when I was young. And my response to that was to try harder and harder to fit within the boxes or to do the right behaviors that could prove my worthiness or prove my rightness as a Christian, which really just compounded what was sometimes my misery. It really wasn't until I got out of the house and got to university and was given access to a broader list of theologians, if nothing else, that I really began to reconsider what love meant and to begin to maybe understand how love is a force, like many forces that exist in the universe, and that force can be leveraged in a variety of different ways by institutions who may claim to be the gatekeepers for access to the divine or to love itself.
Yeah, I know that you told me that you went into therapy. That's why I asked you, was that your choice, or was that your folks are like, oh, my kid's really messed up?
It was very much my folks' choice. I guess that started in third grade. So I would have maybe been 8 at that point, 7 or 8. But
You didn't lean into your parents at 8 and go, now listen, Mom and Dad, I think I need a therapist.
Hey guys, I need some professional help here. I freaked out when I got sent to kindergarten, would lose my mind, and it got worse by first grade. And so they eventually pulled me out of school and homeschooled me for a couple of years. And then when they told me I was going to go back to public school, which probably would have been around when the end of second grade would be, I lost it. If you can imagine a kid that is just crying, whose nervous system is shot, who seems to have actually lost his little mind. I was some version of that. And yeah, it scared my parents to death. And I think what they found is once I got into therapy is I started seeing a child therapist. And I think after the first session, he or one of his colleagues took my parents aside and he was like, hey, Scott's going to be okay. We can work with him. But what you need to understand is everything that you see Scott going through is actually your relationship manifesting in his life. And so if you want him to improve or to heal or pick your adjective, the two of you are going to have to get into therapy as well and understand what it is within your relationship and your lives that are affecting him. And they did.
Ooh, high five to them.
Yeah, I really love that story. I think my mom was very eager to do that. And my dad, I've now been told it felt like actual death to him to consider sharing things about himself with an outsider, but they got in and they did the work. And I think my mom would say that it saved their relationship in the end, but also did wonders for saving that version of me as well.
That's beautiful. That's really powerful. So you've gone through this journey, you've been down that religious path, then you end up in Washington. Talk to us about that, because that seems like, particularly seeing as you were, I believe you were part of the Obama administration, from a conservative Christian background to being part of the Obama, I'm like, oh, okay, a bit of a head scratch here.
Yeah, there's naturally a few pieces tied up in that. So I got to college, still a believer. My purpose in life, as I understood it at that point, was to be a reform agent within the evangelical church. And so I was pursuing God, pursuing Jesus. And as part of that process, my theology began to shift from like a very conservative theological approach that I grew up with to a much more liberal theology. And in that process, my politics slowly began to follow as well. So for context, in 2004, I was a sophomore in college and I really wanted to vote for John Kerry. But like, oh man, I was a Republican kid and I wasn't quite there yet. And I didn't want to vote for George Bush, but like, oh man, I was a Republican kid. And so I flipped a coin that year because I felt it was my responsibility to vote and I didn't know what to do. Like I was in this transition phase. Fast forward a year and a half, like a lot of 2021-year-olds in 2006, 2007 had discovered Barack Obama. And I discovered Barack Obama as, in a lot of ways, I was beginning to lose my faith. I was losing Jesus as a central point in my life. And the story is much longer than this, but the short version of the story is that for a period of time, Barack Obama basically replaced Jesus as like the thing I was driving after. And so I found a political Jesus for a time, and that gave me a lot of meaning and a lot of purpose for what turned out to be all of 2008 when I was on that campaign.
But you said something very interesting there about Obama becoming your Jesus. I wrote a piece very recently that's on LinkedIn, and that is about how Gen Z swung the election. And there's a lot of talk about Trump and Vance going on the bro podcasts and all the rest of it. And I agree. I think that Harris should go on them as well to show the humanity. But the interesting thing for me is, and I wrote this in the article, is what everybody seems to have forgotten. And I asked this of leaders when I had the post-election conversations around those I was politically advising. And I said, let me ask you a question. What did you believe in when you were 21? Do you remember? And most people would go, nah, not really. And I said, I do. And they go, oh, you remember what you believed in? I said, no, I remember what you believed in. And they go, how could you know that? I said, it's very simple. You believed in whatever your parents didn't. Because that's called phase 2 of your psychological development, called individuation. And as part of individuation, you have to go to the other side. You have to go to something other. If you were a Catholic girl who was made to be virginal, you might have become a stripper for a couple of years. If you're a hardcore Republican, you might have found an Obama Jesus. This is a natural evolution, and I think that that was not considered by the left in the last election, and it swung a lot of Gen Z voters to go, oh, I want to rebel. And here's a guy who's saying the wrong things. He's kind of an old man rebel, and that's what was appealing. Not particularly politics, but that appeal to the psychology, by which, by the way, Obama did a beautiful job of, or his campaign did a beautiful job of, with you at that age. It's fascinating how that psychological piece got missed.
Whether it was the Harris campaign or Democrats writ large, there's a strong degree of taking the youth vote, quote unquote, for granted. Plus or minus 20 points in total, I think, was the swing among voters under the age of, like, I'm going to say 26 from D to R this year, which is significant. And men swung more than, or young men swung more than women within that. I also think there's another very interesting point, or two really. Like, one is young voters and young men especially, like, they were 10 when Donald Trump got elected the first time. Well, if you're an 18-year-old now, like, just coming of age, to some real degree, if you're young, like, Donald Trump in office or as a major political figure is part of somewhere between half and all of the total political experience that you have in your life. And within that, like, he is extremely normalized. You've heard people talking about the sky is falling or the world is going to end a lot, and it hasn't, one way or the other. And the second piece, for men especially, is a lot of writers have started talking about what you might call like the crisis with young men, about earning potential, about education, the idea that, like, I have 3 kids, my 2 daughters are doing great, they're out in the world, they're crushing it, and my son lives in the basement and he plays video games all the time and keeps losing money, gambling on like some stupid app. That is a real thing to some degree, and that comes within a social moment where toxic masculinity has become a routine, regular talking point. And toxic masculinity, it is a thing. Elements of masculinity that are unhealthy or maybe unhealed have been driving a lot of our societal direction for a long time. But if you are attacking toxic masculinity at a time when men are generally struggling anyways, and that's not coming with compassion, and it's not coming with empathy, and it's not being delivered along with both a vision and resources for what healthy masculinity looks like, you're only going to alienate people. And there has been a lot of that coming from the left for the last number of years. And I think we are paying the price for that right now.
You're right. There is a lot of talk about toxic masculinity, and it's certainly something to be addressed. Yet there's not enough talk about toxic psychology, which is not male or female. but has left a lot of people alone. And we're dealing with a loneliness epidemic in a post-COVID world. That's a whole bigger piece. I want to come back to your book, because when you and I had our previous conversations, one of the things that came up was the unusual choice of a title. Love is not the answer. And every spiritual woo-woo person is like, love's the answer. We've all got to love each other. But I agree that I think that it's kind of throw around. It doesn't mean anything. Or love yourself, or, woo, I'm loving myself, I'm rubbing my nipples, does it count? No, that's not loving yourself. So tell us why you chose that particularly, maybe even provocative title.
Well, provocative is the word. A lot of the intent is that is a provocative title. If you see that on a shelf, or if somebody mentions it, like your eyebrows raise a little bit, because that's not what we're used to hearing. That's one reason. The second reason is that within the novel, love threatens the two-party system, which leads to both political parties, corporate interests, the evangelical church, all declaring a war on love to maintain profit and power. So it's a nod towards the plot of the book as well. But to the point you just made, you're correct. To say love is the answer and leave that as some sort of whole or cohesive thought is like intellectually or spiritually lazy in the end. Because what love does is it calls any of us to a higher version of ourselves. And words like accountability or integrity quickly rise to the surface when you're thinking about what it actually means to live in love. Love is not soft and squishy. Love is actually a razor edge sword. And if you get really serious about learning what it means to sit in the feeling of love and begin feeling for what love is calling you to in your own life, you discover that love is calling to like absolute honesty. Love is calling you to say the really hard thing to someone that they may think is mean, but is true and they need to hear. And then learning how to say that with compassion or empathy. Love is learning how to take a hard stance in the face of public opinion that may desire or be trying to require you to do something else. So I love talking about love, but I really love talking about it within this broader context of what does love actually mean?
I have always seen from my psychological and spiritual background that love is probably the hardest discipline there is. It's much harder than martial arts disciplines or the boxing disciplines or the mental disciplines that I've trained in. Love is far more difficult, and part of it is because of its nebulousness. It's hard to grasp, and also because it's subjective. I would venture, forgive me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I would venture that in your early childhood, your parents would have seen themselves as extremely loving people. Yet they created a child who was in trauma because of a dogma which was not loving. So that balance of, hold on, I'm being loving, it kind of feels a bit like you got to beat your kid with a big stick if you love them. Well, that doesn't really compute for me, but I can understand you coming from it. I can have compassion for your mentality of it, but it's still not love, although it's your interpretation of. And so for me, that was the interesting thing about the novel. So talk to us about how love challenges. Love is this entity that challenges and the divide.
A quick comment is I've spent years and years working to reclaim love. And what I eventually found is that like within me, this is kind of like my own visualization as I was trying to get at love or reclaim it, is that love, empathy, compassion, service had ended up deeply intertwined with fear, with a sense of betrayal, with anger. Like that all lived together within me, and I had to disambiguate it. And when I had, as a 21, 22-year-old, decided that I was going to cut the pain of the Christian faith out of my life, I had gone in and I cut out the shame, the fear, the judgment, the self-righteousness, and I found freedom in that for years. But over time, what I also discovered is that the love and the compassion and the service had gone with it. And so when I started trying to reclaim love, I discovered I had to go into all of the gooeyest and the ickiest and the most painful parts of my past and just do a lot of healing work, moving back and forth through all of these different levels of self, all of these different conceptions of what God is, all of these institutions that were part of my understanding of God when I was a child and really through my entire life. That was really gnarly work. And that was a lot of time with therapists and coaches. It was also a lot of time with plant medicines of a sort that blast you in ways that are often beautiful and rarely pleasant in the moment as well. There's a reason that we come up with defense mechanisms and we disassociate and we build decades worth of scaffolding around our wounds so we don't have to approach them. And that's because it hurts.
So you're in this political environment, which is vicious. You come there through the word of our father, Obama. I feel a healing coming on. And you come into it through that. And then does it seem like you've stumbled into a cesspool? And by that, I don't necessarily mean the liberals. I just mean the political environment. As somebody battling with your own spirituality, your own sense of what love is, trying to be, I said this to our friend who introduced us to Deke. I said, some of the best Christians I know are Buddhists, and some of the best Buddhists I know are Christians, because it's a simple theme at its root, which is be loving and kind. And then you're sort of battling with trying to find that in this environment that is pretty cutthroat. Talk to us about that, because I'm trying to understand you being in that environment and then obviously leaving that environment.
Another piece of growing up within the faith is that the faith is not built around knowing spirit. It's built around doing the right things, following the right rules. And a big piece of that for me growing up was purity. And so like when you just have to follow the right rules, everything gets really simple, and purity is really easy to measure because you can just look at people's very specific actions and judge them as good or bad, right or wrong. So I was looking for purity for a long time. And initially I had found purity, like absolute rightness, the most worthy cause imaginable with Barack Obama. But it only took me until the North Carolina primary in 2008. So we'll call it March sometime. I'd been on the campaign a few months to have this realization. And this was right around the time he was giving the Jeremiah Wright speech. But I just had this realization one night that Barack Obama was amazing. He was great. But what he was really doing at that moment in time was playing the same political game that Hillary Clinton was playing better. And that was incredibly hard and discouraging for me. And I was in North Carolina. I had a couple rural counties. And so I was kind of like out by myself in Lexington, which is south of Winston-Salem. And I remember sitting on a couch late at night doing data entry, just being like, can I keep doing this? It's not pure. It's not perfect. I think this is valuable, but it's not the world-changing thing I thought I was doing in the way I understood it when I started 3 months ago. And at that point in my time, I finally came to the decision. I was like, well, it's not perfect, but maybe not many things in life are. This still feels amazing. The experience I'm having is incredible. The moral case that got me here can still sustain me largely. Like I can keep doing this and feel good about it. And that was kind of the first piece. And then once you get to DC, you're just like, whoa, this is not this quaint sense of like, we're going to change the world. This is a big business. The knives are out. There are people who've been doing this forever, and they are vicious within the context of how vicious you can be carrying a pen in a suit sort of thing. There were just, for the entire decade as I was there, within me, it really just felt like compromise after compromise after compromise as I came to better understand the reality of the environment that I worked in, and then accept that or change a belief or change a perspective as I needed to be able to stay within that environment and still feel good about myself and the work that I was doing.
That's very interesting to me, because I believe that not everyone, but almost everyone who enters into politics initially does so in the way you did, meaning they want to make a positive difference. But the system is corrupt. You're swimming in corruption. And how do you stay clean? When Barack Obama was elected, my wife and I cried. We thought, oh, a man of color who's articulate, who seems to really care. We were very happy. And 3 years later, I was like, oh, he's not closed Guantanamo, and he's not done this, and he's not done that. And into the second term, I'm like, okay, this is another corporate Democrat. And then I think about, is it possible to not be stained by swimming in that blue or that red water? And that is, I think, in many ways has become the appeal of Donald Trump, which I want to talk to you about in part 2, that he felt to many Republicans and many Democrats, actually, like a new Obama, in that he was outside of the system. He was coming in to do something different. But I don't know that even with some clown car picks for his administration, I don't know that can happen. And so that brings me to this conversation with you about this renaissance, political renaissance. And I want to talk to you in the second part about what you believe is the possibility of that. Is it actually possible to have that system become something else? Or is this the system that is, as I've predicted, the fall of Rome? The Roman system created the Roman Empire, but it also created the collapse of Rome. And I wonder if this is the same. And that's where I want to go to you in part 2 of the show. Before we do that, though, I want to make sure that people know where to find out more about you, Scott, and all the things that you have to offer, your book and all your resources.
Yeah, beautiful. Thanks, Dov. The novel that was released this year is called Love Is Not the Answer. Generally, the easiest place to find that is on a small neighborhood website called Amazon. It's also available in some independent bookstores and similar. You can find out more about me on my website. It's just scottmackey.me, scottmackey.me. So I'll just leave it there for now, Dov. I'm excited to talk after the break in part 2.
Okay, fabulous. We're going to be back in just one click. So stay curious, my friends. Stay curious about how love in the form you've known it may not be the answer, but maybe love in its true sense is. We're going to be back in just one click. Stay curious, my friends. Stay curious.